Hello and welcome to Sensei podcast. This is Manos Brilakis discussing with leaders in the field of CTO and complex PCI. Sensei means teacher or master in Japanese. The goal of the Sensei podcast is to help you learn and improve in CTO and complex PCI so that you can become the best that you can be and offer your patients the best possible results. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Sensei Podcast. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Chris Buehler, one of literally the fathers of CTO PCI, from whom I've learned a lot over many years, and a great friend. Chris, thanks again so much for joining us today for the
It's my
Sensei
pleasure,
Podcast.
Manos. Thank you for having me.
Chris, it's actually fascinating. I was doing a podcast with David Canjeri. He was telling me all about your study with the Tosca and the incidental stenosis. But obviously, you've been on this area for a long, long time. So maybe we start from the beginning. How did you get into cardiology intervention? And then how did you become interested in the complex stuff?
Yeah, I have to dial everyone's clocks back, 3+ decades to tell that story. I was fortunate to go into cardiology just as interventional cardiology was becoming mainstream. So it had been around for roughly a decade. As you know, the first case is done in the late 70s, and then it became something extraordinary at a few centers, and then it became more or less mainstream for treating severe angina in the late 80s. And I started my cardiology training in 1987, perfectly timed to dovetail into this new area called interventional cardiology. And I remember telling, the professors of cardiology that I wanted to do interventional cardiology, and they'd look down their nose at me and I'd say, that's never going to be anything. It's all about pills. It's all about the stethoscope. Interventional cardiology was, just a flash in the pan, I was told. But I had a couple of mentors at Vancouver General Hospital. And I really want to call out someone who some of the audience may recognize. That's Don Ricci, who was one of the very first, if not the very first, Canadian to do a PTCA, and who, until his retirement, was still the most elegant and beautiful operator I had ever seen. He's just an extraordinary technician. And he, from the get-go, was interested in complex things and was questioning, why do we do it that way? Shouldn't we do it this way? Wouldn't it be better if? And it was inspiring. And as a cardiology resident, he recognized the need for me to get training somewhere bigger than Vancouver, and took the personal interest in me to pick up the phone and contact Richard Stack and told Richard he had a cardiology resident who wanted to learn interventional cardiology, and off I went to Duke for about 2.5 years, starting in 1989, where I was Richard Stack's fellow. And I would say that those two were amongst my most important mentors. Don Ricci, because he instilled in me this exquisite interest in doing things well and doing things in a different way and questioning. And Richard Stack, who was also a very fine technician, but whose huge brain and questioning and inventiveness. For those who don't know Richard Stack, he had already patented the bioabsorbable polyl lactide based bioresorbable stent when I arrived at Duke in 1989. He had already patented that. So yeah, those were my early mentors, Manos.
So again, a lot of inquisitiveness, but also great mentors. But for them to help you, obviously, you did your part, and you made them, trust you and work with you, and give you more and more, which you took out to the next level as well. So, what do you do to make them be interested in you and help you through these steps and later on in life as well?
Yeah, well, I can't say what I did that put me in their good graces. I'm not sure. Maybe we can talk about fellows that I've had and what I've picked up on in others. It's hard to be self-aware. what Don did for me, what Richard did for me, and what others did for me came across to me as pure and unbridled generosity. But I can't speak for them as to why they chose to help me along. Uh, when I think about some of the extraordinary fellows that have come past me during their own personal trajectories to excellence, I think about first of all enthusiasm. You just don't succeed, certainly in the specialty and probably in life generally, unless you come at it with enthusiasm. And enthusiasm is not just at the beginning. It's enthusiasm that persists when you're struggling. It's enthusiasm that persists when you have a bad day. It's enthusiasm when the professors of cardiology look down their nose at you and say, interventional cardiology is never going to be anything. It has a kind of a durability, I think. And that durable enthusiasm against, when times are good, when procedures go beautifully, and when times are bad, when a paper is rejected, when what have you, there's all kinds of bumps in the road. Durable enthusiasm through those difficult and easy times is what I recognize as an absolute requirement for excellence.
And how do you get that? I mean, obviously you have it naturally.
Yeah.
You always, seem to be always in great energy and enthusiasm.
You know,
But
I,
is it something
I,
you are born with? Is it something you
I
cultivate?
don't know how we get it. I will say that training, even in North America, where training is relatively rapid compared to say the United Kingdom, um, nevertheless, by the time cardiology people interested in cardiology come out of med school, get trained in medicine, get trained in cardiology, and then are applying for interventional cardiology, I think their personalities are fairly set. I think these are people in their late 20s by and large. Some a little older than that. I think it's probably something that they have picked up and learned from their life experiences that are already behind them by the time they're developing as interventional cardiologists. I think that's probably. I think if you have to tell your fellows to be enthusiastic, maybe it's not the right fit.
That sounds great. So, okay, well, but regardless, I guess even if they don't feel it, maybe they should fake it, so to make a good impression at least from the beginning. I don't know. But coming back, so you trained at Duke, and these were the early days, right? There was not CTO PCI
Yeah.
really happening those days. How did you then go on to learn all the techniques and become one of the prominent people on the field?
Well, Richard Stack and I used to talk about not what we can do, but what we can't do. And So by the time I was finished my fellowship, I remember the last day and going up to Richard's office to say goodbye. And we reviewed again all the things that we still can't do. And it was like, Chris, don't forget the stuff we can't do. That's your job. And I remember the list. The list was left main. Well, we really couldn't do bifurcations back then. We faked it. But definitely left. We were so bad at bifurcations that doing the left main was out of the question. And we didn't have stents yet. Um, CTOs was on the list: calcification, diffuse disease, patients with very poor LV function. We didn't have much in the way of mechanical circulatory support beyond the balloon pump at the time, and rarely did we use that. And there were a few other things that we couldn't do in the coronary sphere. Structural wasn't a thing yet. So all of that was a blank whiteboard. And it was those things we couldn't do. And I looked at them and I thought, the left main is intriguing, and chronic total occlusions, that's really intriguing. And I started thinking about that. But I did not have the imagination to invent retrograde or to invent antegrade dissection reentry. Those were things that I had to learn from others. So I got, as good as you can get at wiring with the wires of the day. And I was persistent and willing to do long cases. And I extended my interest in medical device development that Richard had bestowed on me into developing different kinds of wire technologies that would help with wiring, because that was all my imagination would allow me to think of at the time. Uh, But I do remember, man. This might be interesting to you. I remember making a presentation to one of the major companies, which I won't say which one. Um, it would have been about 1998, and they were interested in guide wires and developing their guide wire portfolio. And they asked me to come and talk about CTOs. And I remember a slide. I think I've still got it somewhere. That was a cross section through a chronic total occlusion, and it showed beautifully the preservation of the adventitia, the media, the intima, the plaque, and the thrombosed or occluded lumen. And I remember saying, and not recognizing the full import of it, saying during that talk that the architecture of the arteries in occluded segments is maintained. And I think that there may be a clue there as to how we should solve this problem. But I wasn't smart enough to figure it out. Just smart enough to recognize that there might be a clue there and not more.
So you went and you did those procedures with the current equipment at the time, which was much less sophisticated than what later came on to become available. And then, you obviously adapted all the new techniques that came out, retrograde, ADR, etc. How easy was it for someone like yourself, who's done so much work, both clinically and on research as well, when things started progressing and new techniques became available?
The biggest barrier was my ego. I thought I was good at CTO PCI in 2005, 2006 because I did have pretty good wire skills, and I was the best guy around in the small little geography of Western Canada. I was the best guy around for that. And the biggest barrier was to acknowledge to myself that after 15 years of trying to get good at something, there was a whole new standard being set. First by the Japanese, by their extraordinary operators of the day, and then soon after by people like Bill Lombardi and Craig Thompson. And I have very vivid memories of seeing Bill and Craig present their early data, that sentinel data, on how much better they got after they learned retrogrades. I was sitting in the audience, they presented, and I was shaking my head, much like the professors who told me that interventional cardiology would not go anywhere. And I was looking at it and thinking to myself, that's not going anywhere. Wrong again, Tonto.
But you recognized it.
And it wasn't 2 years later that I had the privilege of going down to Bill's lab with Stéphane Renfret, from who at the time was in Quebec City, now and of course in Atlanta at Emory. But Stéphane and I went down and watched Bill do cases. And it was just a matter of a few weeks later that Bill came up and mentored me, and we did 3 retrogrades, 3 true to true retrogrades. One of them might have had an ADR, but I think two were true to true. One was an ADR. I'm sorry, one was a RDR, and that was it. I was launched. Bill waved goodbye at the end of the day. We had a nice dinner, and that was it for proctoring.
So you talk about about the professors who did not think much of it, but you had the foresight or the humility or the passion to reinvent yourself essentially, right? After so many years of working on that. Is that something that you are born with or can it be learned?
Well, it wasn't easy. My ego was screaming for a while that surely I was too good to have to relearn what I was doing. But it became undeniable that the field of CTO PCI was going off in a direction that I wasn't part of, and so I needed to eventually check my ego at the door and learn. But it wasn't easy, and I would say that in when I think about lessons in my career, that's maybe the most important lesson for me, is to be prepared to be humble, really humble, and to go back to the mindset of being a fellow, of being a pure learner. Yeah, we have to do that from time to time if we're going to if we're going to stay fresh, and if we're going to stay interested in what we do.
Absolutely. And as you said, many things you can learn, even the things you've done for a while, you can always learn to do them better. And there's always other ways that you can learn. But also, one of the unique things is that you not only have done high level of clinical work, but from early on, you were one of the key people who did research on complex PCI and PCI in general. So, how did that come together, and how did that influence both directions, the clinical and the research part?
Yeah, well, of course, there was an expectation. I was at a teaching hospital and in an academic track, and there was a pretty clear expectation from the people I reported to that I needed to publish. And so fine, I'll publish, but darn it, I'm going to publish about things that interest me. I'm not going to publish about things that don't interest me. So, so that was the situation. I was interested at the beginning in whether or not balloon angioplasty was a futile procedure in CTO PCI, because when I started doing CTOs in the early 90s after getting back from Duke, stents were really they were very, very limited in how many, by cost, by absolute numbers of stents available in any lab, and we really only used them for life-threatening abrupt occlusion. That may not even be a term that many of today's younger interventionalists know. Abrupt occlusion. That's what happens when a balloon angioplasty goes south, often the evening following the procedure. So we did a series at Vancouver General of CTO PCIs and brought them back 24 hours later and had a look at what the vessels looked like. And we reported on, I think it was 40 consecutive successful wire-based CTO PCIs, average lesion length of like 20 millimeters, because we couldn't do anything longer than that at the time. And it was extraordinary how many of them had quietly occluded overnight. A third of them were occluded the next day without a stent, with just a balloon. And most of the rest of them looked like a dog's breakfast. So that made me think, okay, we really do have to stent these, which at the time, it seems so obvious now, but at the time it wasn't obvious. Stents were really a foreign body at the time. Stent thrombosis was a big deal. We didn't know how to manage, and we didn't know how to deploy stents. We didn't know how to medicate people for stents. And so that created the equipoise for the original Tosca study, now Tosca 1, which was stents versus balloon angioplasty and total occlusions. Preposterous to think back on that. But of course, it showed a dramatic improvement in patency at 6 months, routine angiography. And it was a great study to do because it also connected me with Dr. Suzuki in Japan, who was one of our investigators. And I got a chance to go see him. That was before retrogrades were invented in Japan. It was in the mid-90s. But he was also an extraordinary antegrade wire operator at the time, and was already beginning to think about, how to do this better.
Wonderful. So, just curious, how did you come up with the name Tosca? It sounds like
Yeah.
a great name, but was it any story
Well, it's
behind it,
Total
or?
Occlusion Studies of Canada. So most of the sites were Canadian. Um, Later on, as we got through Tosca 2, 3, 4, 5, it morphed into Total Occlusion Studies in Coronary Arteries instead of Canada, because it became a little bit international. Certainly by the time Dave Kanzari was involved, it was Coronary Arteries, not Canada. But that was it. And at the investigators meetings, I always handed out a CD to everybody of a recording of Tosca. That was one of the fun things that we could do back in those days when we shared the results of the trials.
Yeah, exciting times. It's a good thing that the studies didn't follow the fate of Tosca, so we just have the
Yeah,
suspense that comes with it. But obviously,
yeah,
landmark studies again from early on, and again made a
yeah.
big difference on the field.
That's a great point. I hadn't thought of it in those terms yet.
So Chris, you always seem to be well composed, in control. Do you ever get stressed out, anxious, nervous when you're doing those cases, or you're able to keep perfectly balanced?
Well, I would love to tell you that I'm always poised and in control during difficult procedures, but there's a small chance that one of my colleagues who knows me well will see this podcast, and so it's going to keep me honest. Um, so, in the interest of honesty, I think we're all human. Um, as we get more experience, we're less likely to get um, way outside our comfort zone during a procedure. As we get more experience, as we know ourselves better. In the last decade, really, of my practice, we have done all the difficult CTOs and all the gruesome chip cases with two in the room. I've been so fortunate. John Graham first, and now Akshay Bagai, the three of us do the chip and the CTO cases, and there's always two of us there. And I know that that's a luxury that many people can't have for a variety of reasons. Legitimately can't have that, and some people don't want it, and that's fine too. But for me, that has been an enormous help at keeping uh, keeping a a sense of what's really going on in the room, that 360 awareness of everything that's happening in the room, the way a first officer does when the pilot's flying or the captain does when the first officer's flying. Another set of eyes. It's not focused directly ahead, but is focused on that 360 view. That means, how is the patient doing? What's their saturation? What's their heart rate and blood pressure? What other things are happening? Remembering to check ACTs. The millions of little things that have to happen that are not directly in front of you on the main view screen. So I've been so fortunate to have partners who wanted to do that and who also believe in it. And I think that has created an environment for me that is very much easier to stay cool in, to stay objective in, and stay clear-headed in.
Wonderful. And again, the team, as you said, if you can have it, having more people than one who are experienced and care about this is a great way to go. Now, when it comes to training people, and you've trained a ton of people at all stages over the many years, you told me already that enthusiasm is the key thing that you are looking for. Is there
Oh
anything
yeah,
else that makes you to get excited about
independent
it?
thought. Independent thought. And I'm just going to call out um, Simon Walsh for those who know Simon. Simon was the Simon Walsh we all know him to be today when he was midway through his training. He was already um, thinking independently, inventively, questioning us, questioning me, um, and we know where that led him uh, to his extraordinary skill set and extraordinary perspective on our space. So I think that ability to think independently, to not be afraid, and that's closely allied with thinking new thoughts that other people haven't had before. Um, and so I think that that's a very important thing. And then the third thing I would say is integrity, because bad things happen in our specialty. We miss things, we overlook things when we're rushed. Um, we make mistakes. We're human. Having the integrity to own those mistakes, to come clean with them, to discuss them, to be willing to analyze and learn from them. How did I make that mistake? What were the conditions that contributed? How did the Swiss cheese holes line up such that I was in a position to make that mistake? That kind of thinking, I think, is also an essential ingredient in excellence.
And how about the hands, the manual skills? How important are those for the people who want to do PCI and
Table
complex
stakes.
PCI?
Gotta have it. But it rarely distinguishes a great operator from a good operator. I think the great operators up here, we all have to be good. And that may not be
Wonderful.
conventional wisdom. We love to glorify ourselves, but at the end of the day, what we're doing with our hands is not nearly as complicated as what a violinist does with their hands. It's magnitudes less complex. So I think that when you think about it that way, you realize that this is a head game. Minimum hand skills absolutely required. They have to be competent. they should be efficient. We should seek efficiency in our movements, seek purposeful movement, and not have hands doing unnecessary things. We need to organize the space in front of us and know where things are. We need to have instincts about how long and how far things are without looking at them directly. There's all those skills that need to be there. But at the end of the day, they're nothing compared to the decision making and attitude pieces that have to be present here.
And then, what is the hardest thing to teach? You said that many things you can or some things you cannot. What is the hardest thing to teach people?
Boy, that's a tough question. And I think it varies. I think probably every one of us has weakness, whether it's self-awareness, whether it's our hands, whether it's our attitude, whether it's our willingness to be self-critical, whether it's our willingness to dig into the books and know the data, to learn new things, et cetera, et cetera. Each one of us has areas where we're naturally strong and we're naturally weak. So the hardest thing to teach is whatever the fellow's natural weakness is, I think. And identifying it is hard to do as well. You have to be quite thoughtful about why is a fellow doing well and why is a fellow not doing well, and be willing to identify what's holding them back and then work on that.
Wonderful. And then, Chris, you made recently the move to industry and working closely. What was the motivation behind that? How has that been for you? It's a natural continuation of all the work you've done in the lab. How would help you to do this? And would you recommend it to other people, interventionalists who might have similar thoughts down the line?
I'm very happy in my new role. I enjoy every day of it, but it's probably not for everyone. It was something that snuck up on me. It wasn't really a goal of mine to work for industry, so much as it was a natural extension, as I think you've said it. I had that incredible good fortune to get interested in inventing devices by working with Richard Stack, and for that matter with Don Ricci, who has his own extraordinary portfolio of his own inventions. Both of those guys were inventive. And then I continued to do that with wire development and some other simple devices that came along. And one thing I think that I was good at was when something wasn't working in a case, I could say, okay, why is this not working, and how would we fix that from a device standpoint? How do we fix this from a device standpoint? Sometimes it's really obvious what's not working. Sometimes it's not obvious what's not working. It's so widespread what's not working that you just take it for granted. Like it's hard to engage the right corner. You take it for granted. Nobody ever does anything about it. You just learn to do it. But some things are obvious, and so I had the good fortune of having worked with those early mentors of mine. So I was thinking about devices through my career, and one or two things came along that actually were adopted as useful devices. So that was a natural thing to progress to being in industry. Then I think I'd done an awful lot of cases. I didn't go to industry until I was in my early 60s. You've done a lot of cases when you get to age 60. If you've worked in a Canadian hospital where the next angioplasty center is 100 miles away, you've done an awful lot of cases. And it felt like something that would be a nice bookend to my career to see it from the other side. I would add that I think the partnership between industry and clinical medicine in the field of interventional cardiology is something quite special. We don't see that in most other areas of medicine, perhaps in orthopedics, to some degree in neurosurgery, a few other areas, maybe some interventional GI and peripheral interventional radiology, but it's not the same as in interventional cardiology, having seen these other areas. There's an intimacy between industry and interventional cardiologist, and I'm speaking of an intimacy about solutions, not about business. An intimacy about solutions and progressing the field that is quite extraordinary. And so it doesn't feel like I've taken a huge step outside my old self. I feel like I've taken one step to the side or one step, in a different direction, but not really radically in a different place.
Wonderful. And Chris, how do you keep yourself fit? So again, many things, clinical work, research work. I mean, how do you keep yourself in good shape? Do you exercise? Do you meditate? What do you do?
I took up yoga during COVID. I was living alone, and it was very good for my head and for my body. I love to cycle. I love to ski. A couple of back operations. I'm two back operations in, so I've switched from from downhill skiing to Nordic skiing, which I've just absolutely love, and cycle in the summer. And more recently, I took up rowing, which is less less dangerous than riding a bike on today's roads.
Sounds perfect. So exercise has been a big
Exercise,
part of that. And
you got
then,
to stay healthy.
yeah. And then how do you find the time with all the travels and everything? Is it baked in your routine or you find solutions whenever you're going
Yeah, I
or?
mean, I'm not perfect. There's plenty of days I miss exercising because of travel and so on. It's just part of life. But what you can't do is let that get you down or feel badly, feel guilty about it. You just got to get back on the horse when the horse is available.
Sounds perfect. And then how about your favorite book
Hmm.
and movie?
Favorite movie is probably a bit of an oldie, but it's going to be North by Northwest, a Hitchcock film, early '60s,
Hmm.
Cary Grant. Um, and favorite book, fiction. I'm going to say Captain Corelli's
Okay.
Mandolin, Louis de Bernier. Bad movie. It's my least favorite movie. It's a great book. Sorry, Nicholas Cage.
Sounds perfect. I'll tell people. So we'll tell
Just
people
read the
just read
book.
the book, forget about the movie. I love it. So Chris, what are you? You've done so many things, right? So many clinical work, research work, everything. What are you most proud of, personally, professionally?
Hmm. I think, when I moved from Vancouver, where I had started a CTO program in around 2009, 2010, right after Bill had got me started, I moved to the Toronto area and became the cath lab director at St. Mike's and got John Graham and then Akshay Bagai interested to the point where they're now better at it than I am. And I got other people in the big Ontario's Canada's most populated province by a considerable margin, with a lot of PCI centers by Canadian standards, and I had the opportunity to go to hospitals in the Greater Toronto area and even beyond, and do for them what Bill had done for me. That was very rewarding, um, and many of the people that I taught in those situations now have huge, robust programs. People like Ram Vijay come to mind. I mean, he's got an extraordinary program in Scarborough in the east end of Toronto now that is as good as any program. So that's probably my biggest source of pride is helping that along.
And then, how about the future? What are you looking into the future? What excites you down the line?
Uh, New devices. I'm super excited about where PCI is going. I think we've seen the peak of permanent implants, and I think we're gonna see in the next 10 or 15 years backing away a little bit from routine implants of stents, moving to smarter procedures that do deliver drug, where we relearn some of the balloon skills that we had in the 1980s and 1990s and learn. And I think that's also the way forward, Manus, towards the effective treatment of diffuse disease. We're never going to stenting is never going to be good for diffuse disease. So we need a different solution. It's going to be some combination of dilatation and drug, I believe. I'm very excited about that and being part of the development of those technologies that are going to go in that direction. I'm very excited about, lesion modification, and particularly not just as a subject, but the rapidly expanding recognition of the importance of doing a really good job at the lesion, preparing the lesion properly, and doing a great job of dilating and or stenting. I'm excited about those things, and I'm excited to work in industry and be at least a small part of the translation of those concepts into effective therapies.
Wonderful. And, I can sense the enthusiasm you're talking about, so that clearly comes through, which brings to the next question, which is, how much do you sleep?
More now than when I was a full-time interventional cardiologist. No more STEMI call.
So that helps.
Yeah,
that helps.
I think I probably sleep 6 or 7 hours, and that seems to be enough. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So 8 hours is not needed to become to be enthusiastic. So that's good news for many sleep-deprived interventional cardiologists.
Well, it would be ideal, probably. Yeah, it's apparently good for brain health, and I'm of an age where I have to be concerned about brain health. Maybe I should be getting more sleep, but so far not.
No, it's been impressive. So again, Chris, phenomenal work on all these many areas. And you mentioned already about the enthusiasm, other things for the young people who are starting this or early in their career path. If you had to give you some final words that you would advise people that you wish you knew when you were back in their shoes for the early career interventionalist, what would you advise them?
Don't forget to enjoy the journey. It is such a privilege to have the training and the opportunity to look after patients with a craft as beautiful as interventional cardiology. Don't forget to enjoy it.
Sounds perfect. That's a new. I don't think I've heard that one. That's a new perspective, and you're right. It's a great privilege, and we don't appreciate it as much. So often, focus on the tough parts of the job, but it is a great privilege and a lot of satisfaction from helping other people. So, thank you. Thanks again so much. That was wonderful. Really appreciating the time to discuss with me and the audience about your career path, and can't wait to see the new devices coming through.
Thanks, Manis. I've enjoyed it very much.
Thank you for listening to the Sensei podcast.